All right, today is about the buyer representation agreement. One of the three big contracts: the listing agreement, the offer to purchase, and the buyer representation agreement. This is the agreement you use with the buyer when you want to make sure your buyer that you're going to get compensated uh, when this buyer uses you to purchase a house. Irregardless of whether the seller or the listing broker is paying you any money or how much they're paying you. So this protects your uh, ability to collect a commission, at least from someone. Uh, just to tell you the truth, most agents don't use this form, but it's a good form of practice to try to make sure that you're getting compensated for your work. It's a personal choice and a business choice to you, the buyer's agent, on whether or not to use this. We don't require it as a brokerage. We just think it's a good business practice. Because if you could show a buyer 100 properties, and then they go to their friend up who lives in Sacramento and have them write the offer, and they just use you as a taxi and showing service. And there's nothing you can do about it if you don't have a buyer broker agreement. You can't claim you were the procuring cause and you were the one that showed them the property, so you should get compensation. Excuse me. So without a buyer representation agreement, you have absolutely no way to collect a commission if the buyer decides not to use you as their agent. So that's why it's a good idea to use one of these, use a buyer representation agreement. Now, this all starts before you start showing properties, or maybe the first time you show properties with a buyer. But I just want to show you one connection here. Well, let's go out to the buyer representation agreement, and we'll come back to how it connects up with the residential purchase agreement. Okay, we're going to skip all these extra, just like in the listing agreement and the offer to purchase, you're going to have a bunch of additional forms to sign. You should sign them in the order that you see them there. We're not going to cover these forms today because we've covered them over and over and over again in the other trainings. And I'll cover them 2 weeks from now when we do the offer to purchase again, or the listing agreement. But just suffice to say, make sure your buyer is signing these forms first before you actually get to the listing or the actual buyer representation agreement. The most important one being this disclosure regarding agency relation. As you see, it's required by civil code. That means there's a law there that says the agent must do this, and the agents must do this before they enter into any other agreements with a buyer. Technically, you're supposed to do it the first time you ever talk to a buyer. Oh, you're walking to an open house. Oh, I need you to sign this form. Practically, that doesn't happen. You'd scare off every single person who came into your open house if you did that. But yeah, this is one of these things you sign at the earliest possible moment. Anyway, you got the agency disclosure. You know, these things look familiar over and over: fair housing and discrimination advisory, possible representation of more than one buyer or seller, disclosure and consent, and the wire fraud advisory. You see these over and over again. But we're just going to cover today the actual buyer representation agreement and how to get this signed by your buyer as part of your general business practice. Let's see who else we got here. Judy's here, Sarah, Samantha, and Sharif, looks like. Okay, so the buyer representation agreement is brand new form. It just came out in December. It's called the BRBC, the Buyer Representation and Broker Compensation Agreement. Again, this is used to obligate your buyer to pay you a commission at close of escrow when you represent them on a house. And no matter what the other side pays you. Now, as you know, listing brokers pay buyer brokers to bring people to the property and to show the property and write offers and so forth. But they might not pay enough. I've seen anywhere from 1% that the buyer broker gets to 3%. So it's a big range. And you might want to be paid a certain amount. So if the listing broker doesn't pay that, then you need someone else to pay it, which would the only other person's your buyer. So this is where you're making sure that minimum, and then then you can decide whether or not to enforce this. Now, this doesn't have any connection to the lawsuits you might have heard about that are against the National Association of Realtors, among others, including Keller Williams and Coldwell Banker and Zillow and all sorts of people, where they're trying to change how buyer agents are paid. They want to eliminate, the plaintiffs want to eliminate the listing brokerage, the seller via the listing broker for paying the buyer broker's compensation. They want it separated. Has nothing to do with that. Now, knowing these forms is going to help you. And if you implement these forms now, it's going to make it easier when that happens, because that will be part of your business practice. If that happens, I mean, who knows? I know I'll be retired before that happens, because I only got 3 years and 10 days left. So, but if it does happen, it's, if they win this first level, it goes through an appeal. It'll probably be one of these things that goes to the Supreme Court, and that'll take years. But if it does happen, you'll be a step ahead, everybody, because you'll already have in your business practice this process to have your buyers compensate you. So this is a little uncomfortable sometimes when you're getting into a relationship with a buyer. They don't know you, and you're asking them, hey, I want you to enter an agreement that's going to make you pay me if somebody else doesn't. That a lot of buyers, including myself, when I was first buying houses, I was a bad buyer. I was mean to agents, not mean purposely, but I'd have 4 or 5 agents looking for me at once. And I'd tell them, who's ever fastest will get the business. No one ever, and I had one agent, Debbie Brush, who was always faster than everybody else. So she always got my business, but I would never sign one of these. So there's a lot of buyers with that same reluctance. It's like, I don't know you. Why should I sign up for working with you for a period of time when I don't even know you yet? Or maybe they do know you, but when they also say other agents will do this without this, I'm not going to be required to pay anything. Why should I do this with you? So there's a number of different ways to try to address those concerns, because that's the biggest part of this. The forms are easy compared to doing that portion. Can you all imagine the same feeling that you would have? You would have this reluctance. I suspect that, Natasha, did you buy a house and did you sign one of these? And when you had your agent before, did either of you buy houses? Yeah, you did sign this. So there's a lot of resistance for buyers to use this, and and that causes a lot of resistance for buyers out there to actually use this form. Oh, sorry, agents out there to use this form. So if you have that feeling of that's uncomfortable, you're in good company. A lot of people have this feeling. A lot of agents have this feeling. But as usual, we start out with the top. This is a representation period and right to represent. Jane and John Doe grants Keller Williams Realty, beginning on such and such a date and lasting for 180 days, the right to represent them as their buyer's agent. Now, notice it says Keller Williams Realty because that's the broker. All contracts are with the brokerage. This binds them to the, paying the brokerage, and you are the agent, and you sign this later on. But remember, all contracts, listing agreements, offers, buyer representation agreements are all through the brokerage. You're our representative. One of the big questions you ask them right up front, do you have any one of these agreements with anyone else? Because sometimes they do. It might have expired. or it might still be active, or they did a cancellation with some terms. But it's really important to ask them, because you could get into a transaction with somebody, and then somebody from another brokerage pops up and goes, "Hey, I just found out, Jane and John Doe are buying a house through you. They owe me a commission. And here's my agreement that says they owe me a commission." So if you don't ask them this question, then you're not watching out for your client's best interest, because you don't want your clients to pay you and another brokerage commission. And it might be just for specific houses. It might be for, they can't buy anything for another 2 months, and anything they buy is they have to pay this other broker. So in the situation where you might see this, then you want to have that buyer give you the cancellation agreement with their other broker. So you want to see exactly what it means, and you probably want to come to me and review it with you to understand what the cancellation is and what the obligations of the buyer to that other broker. Because even with a cancellation, they aren't showing that buyer more properties, but the ones they showed, they might owe compensation on, and your buyer might want to buy that property. And so now we had that come up last week. So now it becomes an issue. So now here's where you can start talking about why this is a good idea to use you. Now there's the main reason that you want to get someone to work with you like this is you want to get paid, but you got to present to the buyer, positive reasons why it's good to enter into this contract. And one of the top reasons is that when you're talking to your buyer, you're like, "Okay, buyer, a lot of agents just work with everybody that comes along. They got a lot of people they're working with, and they're scattering their efforts over many different people. I only work with people who are willing to make a commitment to me and make sure I get paid. So I limit the number of people that I work with. So in my case, I'm going to limit to 5 buyers or 2 buyers or 3 buyers at any one time, or whatever. You can tell them an exact number if you want or not. But knowing that I'm going to get paid at the end of this transaction, the amount that I need to sustain my business and, pay my bills, send my kids to school and all that fun stuff, is if I know I'm working with people who will ensure that I get paid on my transactions. So here's what I'm going to do for you, buyer, is, when you sign an agreement with here's the 20 things I'm going to do for you. So you as a buyer's agent need to be able to tell the buyer why you're of value. One, the big thing is that I'm going to be committed. You're committed to me, so I'm committed to you. I'm not going to be working with 20, 30 buyers to try to make my living, because, only a few, a certain number of them will actually, get me paid what I need to be paid. So I'm going to be committed to you. I'm going to focus my efforts on you and a limited number of buyers. But here's the things I'm going to do for you. And now you're going to have to write these things down on what you want to provide as your, what do they call that? Your value proposition. I'm going to, set you up on a campaign that'll send you properties every day, any new properties on there. I'm going to be looking at those every single day. You're not going to have to tell me when a new properties come on. I'm going to be looking at that every single day, and I'm going to tell you, hey, this property just came on the market. We need to get out there and see it. I'm going to accompany you to all these, every single listing you're going to go to. I'm going to knock on doors in neighborhoods that you like best. I'm going to knock on doors of homes that aren't even on the market yet and try to find you a property. So that's a value proposition you're going to bring to the buyer to say, here's the things I'm going to do for you. So it's not only about committing them to you and having a limited number of people you work with, but what am I going to do? in addition to what most agents do. Most agents are just going to wait for you to say, "Hey, I found a house on Zillow. You sent, on your thing you sent me this morning, I found a house. I'm going to actively be looking for a property for you." So think of all the active things you could do as a buyer's agent to pump up what you do for them. And one good example is, this wasn't about a buyer's representation, but we had an agent here who got a listing once because he told the buyer or the seller, "I'm going to put your house on the multiple listing service." Everyone does that. But none of the other agents in their presentation told the seller, "We'll put you on the multiple listing service." So that agent looked like they did more than these other agents just by stating the things every agent does. Put your offer on them. I'm going to put your house on the multiple listing service. Woohoo! This agent is really good. So that's really critical, whether it's a listing or a buyer rep agreement like this, is what do you do that makes you a great asset for them in this property search. Let's see, I got a chat here. I have a buyer request for purchase of a mixed-use property to house her business and residence. Would this buyer agreement work for mixed-use property? Yes, it works for any property that you're working with a buyer on. You just need to notice under property be acquired. We have what I've put here has very little details, just some real basic details. So yes, it will work for anything that any property you're trying to find for a buyer: mixed use property, commercial property, residential, lot and land, even lease listings. So, all right, but that's really core, is you've got to come up with your way of telling a buyer what your value to them is. And that's the other part of getting them into this contract. Now, there's also a couple different ways of getting them into this contract. You meet someone for the first time, they don't really know you well, or maybe you've been referred, or maybe they met you at an open house. But you can do this instead of for a period of time, you can do it for specific properties. And the best thing is to have one of these for 6 months or 3 months, some period of time that locks them in for every single thing you see. But say if they're a little reluctant, you could just say, get rid of the San Diego and put in the following properties only, and then start filling in properties here. Or you could attach a list. You could do paragraph 3C and just attach a list. So for these properties on the attached list, or for these following properties that I can list here in this space provided, I'm going to show you those today. And if you buy any of these properties, you owe me a commission. And that sort of eases them into this agreement. You could be asked, and we'll talk about the payments and stuff in a moment. But that's a good, easy step for somebody, because part of the reluctance on a buyer to enter in this agreement is they don't know you yet. They don't know how well you're going to work with them. They don't know if your personalities clash. You could have perfectly good, two good people, and they just, it's just this. It just doesn't, there's no meshing. There's no meeting of the minds. It's just an uncomfortable relationship. They don't want to be in that. So this allows them to just do for the following specified properties that are either listed here or on a provided list. And if they buy that property when you look up here under 1, within 180 days of you showing it to them, then you can represent them and get a commission. Or if they buy it through somebody else, you get a commission if you want to enforce it. But this allows you to, ease them into it. And then the second time you go out, okay, we're going to go, here's the list of properties we're going to go see. And we got a nice convenient form for that now. Here's the list of properties we're going to go see. Let's sign another one of these for today. And then, after 2 or 3 times, there you can bring up, hey, it looks like we're working well together. Do you like how I'm working with you? Say yes. And they say yes. And they go, well, let's do one of these for 3 months instead. So we don't have to do this process every single time we go out. So let's do one now for 3 months. And the buyer's likely to say yes, because they know how you're working. They understand that the listing agent brokerage pays most of this fee or all of it. So you have this, they have a more comfortable understanding of how the process works and your ability to work with them. Does that make sense to everybody? Say yes.
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 Yeah, and that's what I find is most effective for working with buyers, is this step-by-step process, because it gets them past the hurdles of personally meshing with you as an agent and understanding the process and knowing they're not committed to more than just these properties.
Rick, does this form look slightly different now, or is it's called something else? Because the one before was called buyer broker agreement, right?
Yeah, there was something like buyer broker representation agreement. Yeah, this came out in 12/22, and this is the only one left. There used to be 3 levels of this form. Now there's only one.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, there is one called the BRNN, which was abbreviated version of this.
Yes.
So under one, you've got your time period, okay, from whatever today's date is, for 180 days. If you buy one of these properties that's on the list, or that I show you over the next 3 months, or this 180 days, because this is an exclusive for 180 days, then any property they see or purchase in the next 180 days, you should be paid a commission, whether you represent them or not. Now, the reality of enforcing this is more difficult. This is a contract that you can enforce in the courts if necessary. But you might have received this buyer as a referral from another buyer or another seller that really likes you and gives you referrals. And then this person breaches their contract. Are you going to sue them for your compensation and really make this person who referred you really mad? Because it's going to get back to that person, and they're going to be very unhappy with you and not refer other people to you. So it's going to be your option whether or not to enforce this contract. And we as a company aren't going to say, oh, you've got this contract, you have to enforce it. So you're going to make a decision that if this buyer breaches this contract, whether or not you want to actually enforce it. Or even enforce the amount, say the buyer broker pays 2% and you've got 2.5%, whether or not to enforce that extra 0.5%. And we'll talk about that in a minute. So, but that's the other tricky part, is often people you're working with are from a line of good referral people, and you don't want to make them unhappy by suing one of the people they referred to you. That's not going to go over very well with somebody who's referred this person to you. So now down to the compensation. This is the important part. And notice under compensation of broker, there's this bold 10-point font, a little bigger than the 8-point in the rest of the contract. The amount and rate of real estate commissions not fixed by law. They are set by each broker individually and may be negotiable between buyer and broker. Real estate commissions include all compensation and fees to the broker. And that's really important, fees to the broker, which I'll explain in a minute. But this has to be in any form that you're trying to collect money. When you want to try to collect money from a client, whether listing, a seller or buyer, you have to have this notice in there. Otherwise, it's an unenforceable contract, because this notice is required by law. in bold in 10-point font. So if you try to do this on an addendum to a contract of some other sort, it's not going to fly. So you really have to have this agreement, just like you have to have a listing agreement in order to be compensated from a seller. So buyer agrees to pay broker. Let's see, 2.5%, or a flat fee amount, or you might have some sort of attached schedule, which I've never seen anyone use before. So one or two apply. Usually it's a percentage amount because that's what you normally see in a from the listing broker in the MLS, where it says you'll be paid 2.5% or 2% or 3%. So 2.5% of the acquisition price. And what I've put here, for those of you who want to charge the transaction coordinator fee to the buyer, you must put that in here, else you can't charge it to the buyer. So $475 TC fee, transaction coordinator fee. Now, and the reason it's put here is because a transaction coordinator does nothing for a buyer or seller that an agent's already supposed to do. It only benefits the agent past what's required by the agent as part of their fiduciary duty to their client. So this has been ruled by the courts. Any fees charged by the brokerage of any sort to a buyer or seller is a commission. So you must put it in a form that has this bold notice and 10-point font notice right there in the form, in order to be able to collect, have that person pay that fee. Can't just put it on the RPA later without this. A lot of agents think it's okay. Well, I'm just going to put it in the RPA that the buyer shall pay the TC fee. Courts are wise to that. They catch you. If someone complains and catches you, you'll probably lose your license and be fined because you did something that was purely against the law. So if you're going to charge the TC fee to a buyer or seller, make sure that TC fee ends up either here, and for the seller, it would be in the listing agreement. That's just sort of a little general warning that you need to pay attention to that, because in Alabama, a lot of agents lost their licenses, and brokerages went out of business, and some people went to prison. So, and they had to refund millions of dollars to people. So occasionally they target a state. Texas got walloped about 15 years ago for RESPA violations, and people went to prison. Lots of people lost licenses, and millions upon millions of dollars were had to be refunded to buyers and sellers. So now, on the flip side, I give you this warning, but I've never seen I don't know anyone personally who's run afoul of this one. It's just, I, as the broker, if I see that in one of your offers that buyer to pay TC fee, I want to see this buyer representation agreement that allows you to do that. It's perfectly fine to do it. There's nothing against the law about charging this. Now, personally, I don't believe anyone should ever charge a TC fee over to their buyers or sellers, because it only benefits the agent, has no benefit for the buyer or seller. The benefit to the agent, and why TC fees are good, is that instead of you spending 20 hours on paperwork, you got someone who can whip through it quickly and help you out in a pinch while you try to generate more business. So take that 20 hours and turn it into lead generation time, and you'll make $20,000 for spending $475 or $400 in the case of the TC here at the office. They vary, usually between $400 and $500. Does that make sense to everybody? All right. So now the default 4B always applies. Broker's right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to compensation as in paragraph 4A, that's 2.5%. If the buyer during the representation period, which is this 180 days up here under number 1, or any extension, buyers enter into an agreement to purchase, lease, or otherwise acquire a property described in paragraph 3, which is properties in San Diego. What we had here is San Diego County. In the range of $1,000 to $3 million. So basically, the buyer gets one of those, you get a commission. Doesn't matter if you're the agent or not. Now, collecting, I guess that's another thing, because it would be a civil lawsuit if they didn't pay. There's some ambiguity on whether or not you could actually go after the other broker for that. I generally say not, because it's not the current broker's problem. This is a contract between the buyer and another broker, but they do try to do that. They try to come to the broker for their compensation. Usually you're not going to find out if a buyer is in the process of buying a property. You usually find out after a closing has happened, and you decide to look up that buyer and you see they bought a property in the tax records. So it's not always easy to find out, because there's no database of people buying properties out there. Okay. Now, to really nail down things is that under number one, the default is that this is just going to be about properties you show the buyer. And that's the default. So if you have, and there's a form here we'll go over in a minute that shows what properties you showed to the buyer. And that's what the default is. So if you don't check this box under B2, then it's only about ones that you've seen. There's a little bit of ambiguity here, a little bit of gray zone, but if you check this box too, this agreement shall be exclusive and irrevocable, and no matter what the buyer purchases, the seller gets the agent gets a commission. Now, the other part that really solidifies this also is that that if number 2 is checked, neither party shall have the right to cancel this agreement prior to the expiration. So if you want the tightest it can be, put your compensation up here, check box 2, or was it B2 and C2, and that's the maximum amount of protection you can have for getting compensation. Now, if you don't check this box and the buyer cancels, you can see up here it says either buyer or broker may cancel the agreement shall be terminated upon notice or a number of days. If paragraph 2B, then 30 days after receipt of this notice, broker shall be entitled to compensation, but it's only going to be up to the point of cancellation. Unfortunately, in these situations, it's a little vague. So if you want it not to be vague, just check these 2 boxes and it becomes completely specific, not vague any longer. Now, personally, when I've had buyer-broker agreements in the past and someone's canceled, I just release them. I'm not going to sue anybody for the compensation, realistically. I'm just not going to do it. In fact, we had a situation similar to this recently where the seller was angry with their agent, and their agent really did breach their fiduciary duty, did a really, really poor representation of the seller. And this is another brokerage, but the brokerage wouldn't release them from their contract, even with this whole list of egregious acts by their own agent. I would have been saying, yes, we're done, because there's a big lawsuit in this thing. But I never hold a buyer to this after, if they just cancel and go on their way. I don't care. I got better things to do with my life than to try to pursue a buyer who doesn't want to use me for whatever reason, even if they're trying to go around behind my back, which has never happened, and purchase the property directly from the seller. I like nice, easy karma in my life, and I don't believe trying to sue a buyer is going to go anywhere. It's hard to have it go somewhere, and it's really bad. Yeah, that word's going to get around for one, but two, it's just difficult. You have to, the brokerage isn't going to cover your legal fees to try to collect a commission from a buyer that you may or may not have worked with. It's just going to be all on you for something like that. So that's one of the things you have to think about. But if you want to make it solid, do this, because maybe when it's really solid, you could get a agreement from the buyer. Well, if you do, you're going to work now with Fred over here at Coldwell Banker. I'll release you from this if Coldwell Banker will sign a referral fee agreement, and I'll get 25% referral fee for anything you buy. That's the buyer completely off the hook, and you might get something. That's the best way, I think, easiest way to handle something where it could become litigious if you try to enforce it. So does that make sense? Yeah, it's one of those things you can go down the path of litigation and it might not go where you want to go, and it can end up costing you a lot. But if you want to make it solid, do these two things, and it's pretty solid. Now, under E here on the end of the first page, additional broker's right to compensation is that accounting for payments to brokers and other. This is where you outline, this is real important paragraph to outline to the buyer. It says D1, if anyone other than the buyer compensates the broker for services covered by this agreement, that amount shall be credited towards the buyer's obligation to pay. So if you got a 2.5% that you want to collect and the other broker pays you 2.5%, then the buyer will have no obligation to pay you anything. If they pay you 2%, then the buyer has an obligation to pay you 0.5%. And you can decide as an agent whether or not to enforce that. But there's a mechanism ahead of time where the buyer might go, well, I only want to go see properties that give you the 2.5% because I don't want to owe you anything at the end. So they might not go see some other properties. But there's a form for that. Imagine that. Got a form for everything. But now, if a third-party payment's received that exceed the broker's obligation, that X amount will be paid to the broker. That's the default. But when my brother was in real estate, he'd always check this box, credited to the buyer. And that was an incentive sometime for the buyer to use you as an agent. So, you know what? If I get paid more than 2.5%, like if I get 3%, I'm going to give you that extra 0.5% towards your closing costs. And here it is right in the contract. I'm going to check this box, credited to the buyer. And then he called it his fiduciary bonus to the buyer. He says, I'm going to show you any property out there, but if I get paid more than what I need, I'm going to give you that extra. So that's something you can use as an incentive to the buyer to be credited anything above and beyond. Now, if you put 2% up here, most likely you have a higher chance of something being credited to the buyer. So that's a way to do that. So say, hey, look at these properties in the MLS. They're all given 2.5%. I'm going to ask to make sure I get paid at least 2%. But anything above that, as you can see, a lot are 2.5%. I'm going to give you this 0.5% credit towards.
Rick, may I ask you a question?
Yes,
sir?
Please.
Okay. So let's just say you put on this form 2.5 and the buyer broker compensation is 2. So the opposite of what you're talking about.
Yes.
Let's say I prefer not to go back to the listing agent. There are 25 other offers, and I'm not gonna push to get 2.5. So do I do an addendum on our side or something to reflect the fact that the compensation to me as the buyer's agent will be 2, and to disregard what's on this form? How is that handled? I don't typically use a buyer broker agreement or this agreement. So, but I realize I probably should start. So I'm just curious to know how to handle the opposite of what you're talking about.
Yeah, the way this is usually handled is you just tell escrow, hey, the buyer's going to pay me 0.5% commission on this one, and it equals $5,000.
I'm not going to ask the buyer to do that.
Oh, if you don't ask a buyer to do that?
Right. In other words, I'm forfeiting
Oh, I get it.
that 0.5%, let's say.
Okay, so I would do an addendum so the buyer would feel, know that's legitimate and you wouldn't be hit later. I would do an addendum that says, for this specific property, paragraph 4A of the BRBC shall be 2%. And that way,
Got it.
addendum with the buyer that just says, hey, I'm not going to charge you extra for this.
Got it. Yes. Yeah.
Usually-
I usually give credits to my buyers, so I would never charge them.
Yeah.
Well, never say never. So
Yeah.
far, I haven't charged them.
Yeah. And again, this sort of helps set the tone of a relationship. And like most of the time, I don't see very many agents enforce the extra. Though we had a buyer the other day who was mad that the compensation was so low to one of our agents. They go, I'll give you $5,000 or $3,000. I can't remember exactly. I think it was $5,000. So the buyer actually, I don't even know if they had a buyer representation agreement, just wanted their agent to be nicely compensated. So they gave an extra $5 to that agent. So some buyers.
That's wonderful.
Yeah. So, given the right prep and the right conversations, this is not as hard to use as it might seem. And a lot of agents only will work with buyers who do this. And if the buyer doesn't want to do it, they just move on.
Rick,
Oh.
quick question along the same line.
Yes.
So
Ricky.
if there's a buyer, if the percentage is 2% to the cooperating buyer's agent, and you decide to give half of that percentage to the buyer, could you put that in that form? On this form?
Oh, so if you asked for 2% and you were getting 2.5%, and you would check this box here to be credited to the buyer?
No. Let's say you were only getting 2%.
Okay. 2%.
So then you ask half of that 2%, 0.5% to go to the buyer. Would you put it on this form?
I usually do an addendum for that.
Yeah. Are you talking about additional, like a rebate to the buyer?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a spot down here. You can put it on an addendum, or you can put it in other terms under number 11.
Okay. In
A
case you didn't
credit
do this
buyer.
form? Okay.
Yeah, paragraph 11 is a spot you can do that, or you can say see attached addendum and put it on an addendum.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. And last but not least, additional broker right to compensation. Broker shall be entitled to compensation provided in paragraph 4A if within 120 calendar days after this expires. So basically, say you got a 6-month buyer representation agreement, you showed them 100 houses, you give the buyer the list of those 100 houses and then cancel and then it expires. Then for 120 days after that expiration, after that 6-month period has passed, for 120 days, you still have the right to collect a commission from the buyer up to 120 days past the expiration date or cancellation date, either one. So
For all the homes that you personally showed them.
exactly. Yeah. Not for anything new they might see with another agent, where this time frame up here protects them for your right to get a commission during a certain period of time, no matter who shows them a house and no matter who represents them. Or down here, this is for 120 days after it's canceled or expires for the things that you actually did show them that you actually provide a list for. So now that's all. That's the main part of here. Now we're going to go over to a form now that'll show you where you put those. Let's see, make sure there's no other highlights here. The rest is stuff you can just read through and call me if you have any questions on it, but it's just boilerplate stuff. Now, the next one is Let's see, is it this one? Nope, different one. This is a really good form to use and keep for each time you go out with that buyer, whether or not they're just, this is a buyer broker agreement for just one day or for 6 months. That each time you go out to with a buyer, you want to provide this form. It's called anticipated broker compensation disclosure. And what this does is that you put down on this form and say if you're 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you're showing more than 6 properties, you'd have 2 forms. And what you're going to show here is the property address, the date you're showing it. I would say if you're going out today, you just put the same date on there, for showing the property. And then the compensation that's offered by the listing broker. So the buyer will see, and it's from the MLS, the buyer will see these different amounts of compensation, and they know they owe you they know they owe you 2.5%. So they look at it here and they go, well, you know what? When they're making their decision, they might see all these properties that day and go, you know what? I don't want to make an offer on this one because I'm going to owe you 1.5%. But I'm going to get a 0.5% rebate on these 2. Let's make offers on the 2 for 3 that are showing 3%. This could have an influence on on what they make offers on, not what you show them. I don't think it's right not to show a buyer a property, especially if a buyer representation agreement. I don't even do that. If it says 1% in the MLS, and I don't have a buyer rep agreement, I take them to see that property. I think that's our duty as agents to show them everything that's on the market that fits the criteria they want and not eliminate a property over the amount of compensation I'm getting. If I was worried about that, I'd have a buyer representation agreement that I'd enforce. But it might influence the buyer's decision on what property the buyer decides to make offers on. So before you go out, make this form up and have them, and you'll notice they initial over here that they're seeing the property. So you collect these up during the transaction and say you've got 20 of these. Hopefully you don't have 20 of these. That's showing that's a lot of properties you're showing before the buyers, and not getting a property for your buyer. But say you have 20 of these. When you are at the expiration, right before it expires, or right when you canceling, you give them, you say see attached on the cancellation, or just see attached. What is this one called? The brick or the ABCD. This is the ABCD, the anticipated broker compensation disclosure. You give all these to the buyer, and in one email it says, here's the properties that if you purchase in the next 120 days, then you owe me a commission, or by this date, you owe me a commission. And that's how you protect your interest. If you don't give them this list, you have absolutely no chance of collecting a commission, because that's part of the contract that says you will do this and provide this form to them. So, but if you do this form, when you have a buyer rep agreement, if you do this form, then it's a really easy way to show them, show what they saw, because they've even initialed here that they've seen these properties. So they can't go, oh, you didn't show me that property. Well, you initialed it. It's pretty easy to show the courts if there's a battle that this has been done. So use these, keep all these. And it's a really good way to inform your buyer, hey, you owe me 2.5%. Here's the ones that meet that criteria. Here's the ones that don't. Here's the ones where you're going to get a bonus. That might influence their decision. It's now, one of the reasons we have this form now is in the past, the buyer representation agreement process was sort of a lot of things hidden about it. That it was information like this wasn't readily given to the buyer because it's not on the buyer's MLS sheet. It's only on the agent's MLS sheet, how much they're going to be paid. So they would be surprised at the end of the contract when the buyer's agent's asking them to pay 1% commission or 0.5% commission. They didn't have anything to know ahead of time to what was going to happen with the money they owed their agent until they were already in a transaction and close to closing, and then all of a sudden they find out they owe the agent $5,000. That's not, it's just not done under the light of day, and there was a lot of unhappy buyers around that. Is that form pretty quick, easy, simple? All right. Let's see. Now, say you've got a buyer representation agreement. It does connect into the offer process. Way too many forms. All right. So on page 2 of the RPA, paragraph 3G3, and this is referenced in the buyer representation agreement, that if you have a buyer representation agreement and you want the seller, this is a little different than I learned a little bit more since the last time I taught this. So if you were here last time, this might sound like a difference, and it is. You check this box if you have a buyer representation agreement with the buyer and the amount the buyer broker is being compensated is less than what's in the buyer representation agreement with the buyer. So if it's 2.5% to the buyer broker, 2% to the buyer broker, and your buyer owes 2.5%, then you want to check this box. Oh, and the third thing, and you want the buyer, the seller to pay this additional amount. Let's say the buyer wants the seller to, well, let's see if we can get the seller to pay it. Then you check this box. If you're not going to enforce the extra 0.5% or whatever amount on the buyer, you don't need to do this. If you just tell the buyer, it's 2%, you owe me 2.5%, but I'll just take the 2.5%, the 2%. Let's not worry about the other half. Here's your addendum releasing you from that other 2.5%, that other 0.5%. So you don't need to check this box if you're releasing it from it. You don't need to check this box if the amount of compensation is equal to what the buyer's paying you. You don't check this box if the buyer says, no problem, let's not ask the seller. I'll just pay you that I'll just pay you that extra 0.5%. You only check this box is if you're going to try to get extra money from the seller than what's being offered. So you check this box and you're going to add in the SPBB form. So let's go back to the SPBB. And this is how you obligate the seller to pay that extra money that's the buyer would owe you as the buyer's agent. So again, the top is as usual. Buyer has entered into a written agreement to compensate the buyer broker 2.5%. So this is from your buyer representation agreement, the BRBC, or a dollar amount. As of the date, the seller payment for the buyer broker document is signed by the buyer, and pursuant to the MLS, this is the CBB that you see in the MLS, says 2%. The amount the listing broker is paying the buyer broker. Seller broker has agreed to pay the buyer 2%. And so seller agrees, and so there's a discrepancy here. You're 0.5% short. So seller agrees to pay buyer broker 0.5% of the purchase price, or an amount of money, and it actually tells you here the amount in paragraph 1 less the amount in paragraph 2 is what you put here. So if you can't remember when you actually are using this form, it tells you exactly what to do. So this is the 2.5% minus the 2% means there's 0.5% that the seller agrees to pay buyer broker. It's an agreement right here that the seller is signing up for. So this is the form you use if you're going to want the seller to pay that amount. So, and it's between buyer and seller. We don't need the agreement with the brokers. because it's going from the seller is paying the buyer broker amount because that's on behalf of the buyer. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, that's a nice, easy form. Again, it's a nice mechanism for getting this done. There is a second mechanism. It's called the CBC. That say if the seller doesn't want to pay this, you can ask the buyer's broker, the listing broker to pay that extra money. As a listing broker, I always say no. I go, no, I'm not gonna pay it. It's 2% in the MLS. That's 2% you're getting. I just, when they're part of an offer, I just crumple it up, throw it away, and just send an email that says no. So I wouldn't actually go that direction. Now, the CBC is only really useful if you haven't made an offer yet. Once you've made an offer, you've lost all your leverage on trying to get the listing broker to pay you more money. So they already got that offer in hand. You've told your buyer, hey, we're making an offer, and you start making it about the commission at that point with the other agent, you're going to lose. I mean, it's not going to go anywhere because unless the market turns south, well, if the market really turns south, I guarantee you those amounts offered the buyer broker and the MLS go up because they're trying to incentivize you to bring your buyers. All right. Now, in the unfortunate situation, say gone through the whole process, buyer wants to cancel your agreement. We have, as usual, a handy dandy form for that too. Cancellation of buyer representation. The COBRA form, COBR. Keller Williams and Jane and John Doe. It's a notice of cancellation. A representation may be canceled by either buyer or broker, both signing the applicable box below. Now, this is where you're going to try to obligate the buyer or make sure the buyer still knows they're obligated. And if you find remember you asked that question of a buyer, if they have any other obligations to any other brokers, you're going to ask for their buyer representation agreement and this cancellation of buyer representation agreement. You're going to want to see what the terms of the cancellation are. So there's two things you'd get as their new buyer agent if they had one of these that went before you showed up. Usually say who signs this. If a broker is canceling on a buyer, it's hard to try to rationalize telling them that, hey, if you buy one of these properties, you owe me a commission. Usually it's the buyer canceling these things. Brokers, as an agents don't usually want to cancel. So you're normally going to have this buyer box check. Buyers canceling the contract. When is it canceled? The default is immediately. Buyer gives you this, it's canceled. So unilateral cancellation, you don't want to try to work with someone who wants to cancel on you. So I wouldn't recommend saying, no, you can't cancel this. You get a cancellation done and pursuant to how you're going to be compensated if they buy one of these properties that you've already showed them. That's, I think, your best case scenario. Just saying, so nope, you can't cancel. You can only use me and only me going forward. It's going to be a miserable relationship, and you'll probably get sued for not representing them well, or when they'll find things in the house to sue you about. It's just, you're setting up a bad trap for yourself if you try to continue this past when a buyer wants to cancel on you. And sometimes it's a very legitimate reason for cancellation. But you as an agent didn't do a good job, or you have a personality conflict, or all sorts of things like that will just make someone not want to work with you. So, but canceled immediately. And you fill in, let's see, it's a written agreement, 100 days. Wait a second. not, sorry, wrong spot for that. So it's immediate. And then you go down to compensation. Now, if you just want all the defaults to apply that were in the BRBC, the buyer representation agreement to start with, then you don't have to do anything past paragraph D. Oh, but yeah, because you'll see here in E that it's basically saying whatever's in the BRBC is what applies. So if it's for a 6-month list buyer representation agreement and they're canceling after 3 months, if they buy anything in those 180 up to that 6-month point when this was supposed to expire, the agreement expired, they owe you a commission. And after the expiration, up to 120 days after the expiration or the cancellation, they owe you for any property that you showed them, that 120 days thing. So, but if you check box 2, that means it's going to be one of these items on page 2. So you can pay, let's do the easy ones first. Expenses incurred. Maybe your broker incurred, as an agent, incurred $1,000 worth of expenses. Buyer agrees to pay broker for $1,000 prior to cancellation. You get your $1,000, you're happy because they repaid you for, I don't know, maybe you paid for a report or something, or some inspections. So you can put that in there, and that's to be paid prior to cancellation. Broker to receive a referral fee. That's what we talked about. I think that's your best case scenario, is just get a referral fee from here. Broker will receive a referral fee from another broker pursuing a written agreement with that broker. That buyer might not know who the other next agent will be, but they're required by this contract to give you a referral fee. And you'd put down under other, item C, referral fee shall be 25%. So you have a referral fee, but when the buyer's responsibility to tell their new broker or new agent that I owe a 25% referral fee over here to Samantha at Keller Williams Realty. So we need to do an RFA between the two brokers. Broker to receive compensation from the seller. And I'm not sure, I don't know what scenario that one would be. So if you wanted to do that one later, call me and we'll research it a little more, because I'm not sure why a buyer broker would receive compensation from the seller, because I don't see a way to enforce that. The one I do, unless they're owed me some money, which I've never have had happen before, I would do no compensation. Buyer owes no compensation to the broker. Like I said, I don't care. They want to cancel with me. See you later. Have a good life. I'm heading to the beach. I'm going to sleep, when I was going to show you houses. Whatever it might be, I always check this one. Again, not a broker requirement. It's just, I think, in general, the easiest way just to go quietly into the night and part without any animosity or potential animosity in the future. So that's my favorite one. Sometimes my personal biases creep in here and there. And then this is where I'd put in something like referral fee for item 3C shall be 25%. Again, you're going to have this cancellation happen so infrequently that please give me a call when you're trying to decide which one of these things to do. So now this is subsequent to the acquisition of property during a representation period or extension. This is where you'd put that 120 days that you'd put in the original agreement that if I show you these properties and you cancel for the next 120 days, whatever's on this list is what you owe me for any of these properties that you've seen. Or some of them they might have made offers on. So does that make sense to everybody? I said, you don't have to memorize these things and be an expert at it, but understand what's there and call me or Sharon, when these things happen, because the likelihood of most of you using a cancellation form, a buyer representation agreement is somewhat small, so you might not even ever come across this, but happy to help you when the on-demand training. But I'm glad you're here to at least understand the basic process. There is one other form that goes with the cancellation, which is the very last one there. Let's see. Notice of identified properties. If you're canceling an agreement, number 4 is your broker involved properties. And that could be that ABCD form that you say, see attached ABCD forms, or you could put in every single property that you showed them. Maybe you only showed them a couple properties. You could put it right here and not have to provide the ABCD form. I like the ABCD form because it shows the property, shows the compensation, and the initial on it that they saw, basically have seen the property. So there's no wiggle room in that form, where this one is just telling them, hey, I showed you these properties. And you may or may not have that ABCD form. But I would just say see attached ABCD form, because if you're going to use a buyer representation agreement, you might as well use the ABCD form, because that is what your core protection is for that agreement. All right. And that's about it.